So, I recently learned something interesting. According to long-term studies, women make great cops, like really great cops. Did you know that? I did not know that. But studies show that women police officers across the board bring unique advantages to police work. Women cops use force less often and less excessively than their male counterparts. They achieve better outcomes for crime victims, especially when it comes to cases of sexual assault. And they're generally perceived as more trustworthy by diverse communities. I find this interesting on a whole bunch of levels, and we're going to talk about all of them on today's show with my guest, Maureen McGough. But before we do that, there's something I want to talk through with you all first, this weird paradox. It's this. Although I'm opposed to violence and the use of excessive force of any kind, if I'm being honest, I'm also kind of fascinated by violence. I mean, I'm someone who watches Twin Peaks, a show about the brutal murder of a beautiful blonde teenager, to calm down, right? I lived for Breaking Bad, and like half of New Mexico gets killed on that show. So it's weird, right? On one hand, I'm very much against violence. I'm not violent myself. I'm horrified by all the violence I see going on in America today. But at the same time, I am kind of fascinated by violence. I think a lot of us are. I mean, every grandmother I know is obsessed with NCIS. And true crime? I can't remember the last time I cleaned my kitchen without a true crime podcast playing in the background. Anyway, I bring all this up because before we get into today's show, I want to make clear that I don't think women are more virtuous than men or in any way better than men. I think we all have light and dark inside of us. And if Netflix is any indication, most of us humans are fascinated by violence in some way or other. However, women do tend to be less violent than men. That's a fact. 90% of violent crimes around the world are committed by men. And as we said earlier, women cops are statistically less violent than their male counterparts. So Maureen McGough, my guest on today's episode of The Control Variable, thinks these statistics are really important. She thinks women have figured out something about conflict resolution that men haven't. She thinks women might actually play a crucial role in fixing our police system. She's awesome. So here's the deal with Maureen. She's the chief of strategic initiatives at the New York University School of Law's Policing Project and the former director of programs at the National Police Foundation. Before she joined the National Police Foundation, she spent a decade with the federal government in various roles at the U.S. Department of Justice and Department of State. She also served as senior policy advisor to the director of the National Institute of Justice. But probably the coolest thing Maureen has done is co-found something called the 30 by 30 initiative with a police chief from Newark named Yvonne Roman. 30 by 30 is a coalition of police leaders, researchers, and professional organizations who have joined together to advance the representation and experiences of women in policing agencies across the United States. They founded it together back in 2018. And the goal of this organization is to increase the percentage of women in police recruit classes to 30% by 2030. McGough says, as protests over the police killing of George Floyd have refocused national attention on police abuses and use of force, law enforcement experts and leaders say one powerful reform would be simple: hire more women. Currently, women only make up 12% of sworn officers and 3% of police leadership in the U.S. And McGough says this underrepresentation of women in policing actually undermines public safety. That the more women cops there are, the less violent our police system will be. Lives will be saved. The good news is, since the tragic killing of George Floyd, McGough says police departments have been increasingly open to new ideas, like to an unprecedented degree. So a lot of police departments around America have actually signed up with the 30 by 30 initiative since it launched, including police departments in Baltimore, Kansas City, New Orleans, Seattle, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Memphis, Miami, and New York City. But there are almost 18,000 agencies in total in America, so there's still a lot of work to be done. Are women the key to fixing the police? Let's find out. I'm Kim Cutter, and this is The Control Variable. Here's my chat with Maureen McGough. Welcome, Maureen. I'm thrilled to have you here.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here and really appreciate your kind words about 30 by 30 and have to give full credit to my co-founder, Yvonne Roman, who was in the trenches in policing, retired chief out of Newark Police Department. And she's the one who really turned a lot of us on to the unique value of women, the reasons for their likely underrepresentation, and really lit the fire under us to do something about it and to commit to getting to 30% by 2030.
How did it start, this whole 30-30 initiative thing?
It's a great question. It's still a little bit surreal to me, so I appreciate the opportunity to reflect on how we even got here. But my co-founder, Yvonne Roman, she was a longtime officer with the Newark Police Department. And while she was there, she was noticing she was losing a lot of women at different parts in the application process. It made her interested in sort of women in policing in general. She herself is a researcher. She's almost done with her PhD. And she really dove into the literature out there. And one of the things she found was that women officers made up 12% of officers in this country, 3% of police leaders. And those numbers had remained stagnant for decades. At the time, I was working at the U.S. Department of Justice, and I had worked with Yvonne on a number of issues around evidence-based policing. And in her very endearing, like New Jersey way, she came to us and she said, look at these numbers, look at the literature around how valuable women officers are. Why isn't the U.S. Department of Justice doing anything about this? And that really kicked it off. So Yvonne and I joined forces in 2018. We had a national summit on women in policing. We brought together over 100 women in law enforcement, everyone from commissioners of major departments to women with 6 months on the job. We brought together researchers, policymakers, and we wanted to understand, what do we know and what do we need to know in order to improve the representation of women, but also transform police culture so that policing agencies are a place where women aren't just surviving, but they're thriving.
Right. So tell me, based on your research, how policing done by women is done differently. Like what's the deal?
I love that question because that body of literature is growing by the day. And it is the reason why we're pursuing these objectives in the first place. Gender parity in and of itself is important. But part of the reason why so many of us are fighting so hard is the unique value of women officers and their ability to address so many aspects of the policing crisis that we see. They're certainly not a solution to every problem in policing, but they are uniquely valuable. So just top line, some of the research shows that women officers use less force and excessive force. Women officers use their discretion to make fewer arrests for minor misdemeanor offenses. They make fewer traffic stops, but they're more likely to find contraband when they do. So they're not abusing strategies or overusing them. Communities who are most impacted by policing perceive women officers as being more trustworthy and compassionate. Women officers are less likely to fire their firearm in the course of their career. Women officers are named in community and civilian complaints less often, and they're associated with better outcomes for victims of crime, especially victims of sexual assault. So when you think about all of that together, right, if there was some training that you could access out there that offered all of those benefits, every department in the country would be clamoring to implement that training. But we're just instead thinking differently about who we value as police officers.
So do you think that that's why this sort of the initiative didn't get created sooner? Like how we've gotten this far without anybody having this idea and taking an initiative like this?
So, I will say we are the latest people to advocate for this, but we certainly aren't the first. And there have been a lot of various efforts over the last decade, some championed by the late Chief Penny Harrington out of Portland, who was the first woman to run a major metro department. She and Kathy Spiller worked really hard on the National Center for Women in Policing, and they made some progress. Some consent decrees have sort of valued the gender diversity as something that police departments should aspire to. But I think the critical turning point that has allowed us to have the success that we've had so far in just a year of the 30 by 30 initiative was the police murder of George Floyd. It made it absolutely unavoidable that we have to confront that the status quo is no longer tenable. And you'll recall that Yvonne and I first started doing this work in 2018, and it wasn't until 2021 that we were even able to launch. Because 2020 created space to work in policing that I think historically has not yet existed. And we're finding a lot of support in agencies who are willing at historic levels to think critically about what they've done in the past and reimagine a different future and what it looks like.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. And I guess be open to new ideas about what that future might look like.
Absolutely.
So, and I think one of the smarter things that you guys do, among many smart things, is that you make the argument that the current percentage of women police officers in America and percentage of women police in leadership, in positions of police leadership, that this actually undermines public safety, which struck me as a very savvy way to position it, just in the sense that, if you can actually make that argument, that it's really hard to deny, right? It's really hard to sort of turn away from that.
100%. And I think that's one of the most compelling things for police leaders. We're not doing this for gender parity's sake alone. We're doing this because it's critical. The research is showing, and granted, the research is limited. This hasn't been a priority area. We need a lot more money for research. We need a lot of replicated studies, but it's all trending in a direction that shows that women officers are uniquely valuable. And there's also a lot of compelling research about sort of the value of a police department that reflects the demographic diversity of the communities they serve. And I think you're exactly right that it's pretty hard at this point to deny the utility and the value and potential impact of improving representation.
I want to just take a moment to point out how incredibly successful the 30/30 initiative has been. And just say, because this is just such an amazing accomplishment, that in just a year, participants include the police departments of Baltimore, Charlottesville, Denver, Kansas City, Nashville, New Orleans. Hold on. This is just like, we're not even done yet. Seattle, Waco, Philadelphia, Richmond, San Diego, DC, Austin, Dallas, Los Angeles, Memphis, Miami, and New York City. Which is just, I mean, those that's not even close to all. That's maybe like, that's just the bigger marquee names. And I'm amazed by that.
So we're at over 180. And that was, that's on a shoestring. We've had no money to recruit and try and get the word out and get police departments to the door. And I think what happened is when we launched, we didn't know if anybody was going to show up. And then one of the first folks to show up was the New York City Police Department. And Tanya Meisenholder, who was the Deputy Chief for Diversity and Inclusion of NYPD, she really advocated for us. And having NYPD with us from the very beginning, I think, really motivated other folks to join, particularly from other major metros. And then for some of our smaller departments, our suburban, midsize, or even small and rural, there we found that it's really regional impacts. So we have a chief, his name is Ken Clary, he's out of Bellevue, Nebraska, and he is a huge gender parity advocate. He really understands the science. He's a huge advocate for women in his department. He was the first agency to sign our pledge, and he made it his mission to get other departments in Nebraska to sign the pledge. So it's so inspiring to see. And inevitably, that's what happens. We get a new agency from a different part of the country that we haven't been working with before. And inevitably, you'll see 2, 3, 5 come in over the next couple of months. Because I think people appropriately believe in it as a really important way forward.
Sure. One thing I did think about when I was sort of listening and when I've been reading about the 30/30 initiative is that obviously this is all taking place in the context of a much larger conversation about gender and gender construct. And I wondered how you sort of think about your initiative in relationship to the larger conversation about gender.
This space is exceedingly complicated. I know that's not going to be a newsflash to anyone, but it's really easy to get gender reductionist when you talk about this stuff, right? It's very easy to say, oh, we're advocating for more women officers because they're more emotionally intelligent and men can't be emotionally intelligent. Or, oh, we have to look at the physical fitness requirements because women can't pass this or women aren't strong enough, or, vice versa, right? Men can't be good officers, women can't be good officers. And that's just simply not true. We really stick to the research about differences in performance across primary genders. And that seems to be compelling enough to warrant working through. That being said, there is a ton of additional work that we have to do as an initiative and that we have to do as a society as a whole, right? To understand where exactly on this continuum of gender expression we need to focus, because the last thing we want to do is unintentionally exclude anyone from consideration or support. And one of the things you'll see in our pledge, our action items that people who are part of the 30 by 30 initiative sign on to, is that there's very little in there about addressing particular genders. What you'll see is we want to get more accurate about what good policing looks like. We want to make sure that unique needs are met. And it just so happens that because the status quo has been so traditionally cisgender, male, white, that there's a failure to support anything that isn't that. So we're trying to create this space to look a little bit differently at what it is that we address in policing, who we support in policing. And this is just sort of the first of many, many conversations that need to happen about how to support and diversify the workforce.
Sure. I mean, something that also came up for me was this question that Dr. Samantha Simon has raised from the University of Missouri, from the Department of Criminal Justice, in which she did a bunch of research and that showed that basically, and specifically spent time in police academies, observing police training, and was even more struck not so much as the difference in gender behavior as by the rhetoric that was being taught to all police officers in the police academy, right? So that there was this constant emphasis on violence and danger that was being sort of hammered into the recruits, but also that their acceptance into the academy was largely determined by their response and enthusiasm for that kind of narrative. And I found that really striking and interesting. And it's a different. I don't want to say that this is the same conversation, but the question of the rhetoric that police are being trained with, and the way that they're sort of being taught to frame their interactions is really fascinating to me. And I wonder if that's on your agenda as well, or I don't know.
So I so appreciate that you asked that question, because when I heard that Vox podcast, I hadn't heard her comments yet. Like, I think I recorded first, and I felt like it was framed as an either or, right? And that she was sort of a counter. And I think she probably agrees with a lot of what I was saying. I agree with a lot of what she's saying. It goes to that point that women aren't the panacea. There's a lot more problematic aspects of policing than just the underrepresentation of women in the force. And absolutely, looking at training is a huge part of it. The Bureau of Justice Statistics I think 4 years does a census of police training and really looks at the different subject matter that's taught in academies across the country. There's no national standards, of course, right? Every state and sometimes every locality is free to sort of train on what they think is most appropriate. And if you look at that training and you categorize it by subject matter area, a lot of it, the vast majority of it, is around force and enforcement and the law. And then you look at the research around how police spend their time, and it's talking to people, de-escalating tense situations, performing inherently social worker type behavior, type tasks. So absolutely taking another look at police training, what it is and how we're training our officers is critically important. The other thing about noting that, women in these positions tend to assimilate, that's part of the reason why we're going for the 30%, because the theory of representative bureaucracy shows that until an underrepresented group gets to 30% in an organization, they can't actually impact the organization in a way that's going to change it. Up until 30%, they're just trying to get by and survive and get along.
So they just can't really be heard. They don't feel like they are being heard until they get to 30%.
100%. So we actually expect that in police departments across the country, you would see that type of assimilation as a strategy for surviving in an environment that wasn't built for you.
Yep. Sure. No, that totally makes sense. I always come back to this thing that, like, the broad truth is that historically men conquered and women sort of kept it together. Those have been the traditional roles since, time immemorial, right? So even if it's just that because for several thousand years, women have historically spent more time in the home where conciliatory behavior and nonviolent conflict resolution is necessary, right? Because you want to keep your family together, right? You're not trying to conquer anybody. Your whole agenda is totally different, right? Instead of going out, you're like all about circling. I mean, I know I'm being broad, but I do actually think that, and I don't even know, I wouldn't make the argument that this is necessarily even a DNA thing. I mean, you could potentially say, well, it's just that these women have been going to, for 2,000 years, have been going to the gym of domesticity, which inherently prizes nonviolent conflict resolution. And we need that,
absolutely.
Right?
It's interesting. I think some people are really interested in getting into the, is it a artifact of biology that women are performing this way? Are they socialized to perform this way? And at the end of the day, I'm kind of agnostic about it because they are performing this way.
Totally.
Right? We're getting the outcomes we're looking for because of how women are policing. And that to me feels like a good enough reason to give it a shot. I love the way you described it, sort of what did you call it? The gym of?
It's like the gym of domesticity, right? Or the gym of nonviolent conflict resolution, right?
Well, and just in addition to just sort of social constructs around gender and what jobs go to which genders historically, the other thing is going hands-on and escalating a conflict into a physical conflict. If you are a significantly smaller person than the person you're interacting with, is not the best thing to do.
Right.
I heard some really inspiring stories of de-escalation from a woman who's a commissioner of a major department. And she just said, I never tried to go hands-on. That was absolutely my last resort. Like, I used my brain and my mouth so much more than I used any of the weapons available at my disposal, because I knew that was going to get not only the best outcome for the person she was interacting with, but the best outcome for herself. Because if it came down to a question of brawn, she was never going to win.
Right. So which of those stories sort of has stayed with you the most powerfully, out of curiosity?
I've heard some really horrible war stories about what it is like to survive as a woman in policing in this country. And I've heard some really beautiful stories about sort of just the contributions of women and the unique contributions of people who are women. I think the one I'd like to share, because it's the most sort of practical, is actually from my co-founder. We work a lot around physical fitness assessments. And that is because in many jurisdictions across the country, what they test for, whether you could be a police officer, the physical assessments that they use have absolutely no basis in what the requirements of the job are. So they've been testing the same way for 60 years. It just so happens that they tend to focus a lot on upper body strength. Proportionally, women are stronger in their lower body, things like that. They have nothing to do with what it takes to be a good officer. And they disproportionately weed out women in a way that might actually rise to being unconstitutional in certain jurisdictions, right? That's certainly a priority of ours. And when we suggest changes to the physical fitness assessment to make them more accurate for the requirements of the job, inevitably we get the pushback, you're just trying to lower the standards. And Yvonne's got this great comeback of, I was a cop for 30 years. I put cuffs on thousands of people, and I never once dropped and gave them 30 push-ups before I did it. Right? Why are we looking at that? Or if you're running a mile and a half after a suspect, you are doing it wrong. Where's your backup and where's your cruiser?
Right,
let's talk about how we actually achieve the job. And that's not to say that there aren't physical requirements to it. It is a physical job. I mean, if anything, physical fitness is really important for mental health and resilience against the trauma that a lot of officers are exposed to. But the other aspect of it is, if it is so important, why do so many departments just test for it once and then never test for it again? Right? You qualify with your firearm every year, but most departments don't actually assess physical fitness. So that's a very tangential answer to your request for other stories, but there are many.
No, that's a good one though. On that note, I'm sort of curious about what have been some of the biggest challenges you've faced in terms of getting the word out there and getting departments to sign on to the 30/30 initiative.
First is, I think, funding, though it hasn't been as much of a barrier as you would think. And that is because though the police murder of George Floyd created a lot of opportunity to work, and I think humility in police leadership, that's pretty historic, it also decreased the interest of philanthropic funders in investing in initiatives that work directly with police departments. I think we saw a lot of interest in litigation or legislation or, taking funding away from departments and investing in social services. And all of those things are also critically important. But investing in something that's going to directly benefit a police department has been much harder, I think, than it historically has. Though I think because we've gotten so much traction, it's going to be a little bit easier moving forward. And we have gotten some funding in the last couple of months. The other is just sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is that we're up to. So to the extent that we've gotten pushback, it tends to be from folks at the rank and file level. And they think what we're doing is trying to offer women officers advantages or suggest that men can't be cops or say we need to lower the standards. And all we're saying is we need to get accurate with our standards about what it takes to be a fair and effective police officer. And when you do that, you're going to start naturally seeing an increase in demographic diversity. And also just really acknowledge we're not saying men can't be good officers. We're saying historically men have been considered the only people who can be good officers, and women can as well. And look at all of these unique benefits. And I think once that sort of people are disabused of that sort of fundamental misunderstanding of what we're up to, like you said, it's really hard to oppose. It's just on its face a very logical approach to a very critical need.
Yeah, like literally a pragmatic thing.
Yes.
Yeah. But I wondered historically if excessive force has been kind of always a problem in our police departments. Obviously, it's probably been worse and better at times, but I just wondered if you could give me a sense of context here.
So I think the short answer is yes, with a caveat that data collection around use of force in policing is extremely, extremely limited. And I think it's only recently within the last couple of decades that we're even able to articulate with any type of specificity what's happening. Similarly, demographic information and demographic data around individuals with whom the police interact is also really limited and lacking in quality. So understanding disparate impacts of that use of force is problematic because we have a real data problem in policing.
It's actually an instance where I wonder how useful the historical context really is, in a sense. I mean, it just seems so much more important to figure out how to do it better. And I'm not sure, given the background of just of violence in America and of violence in our in our institutions, that maybe referring back is really just not that relevant here. And that what's really important is envisioning the most fruitful and healthy way forward, right?
I could not agree more. I mean, I don't think any of our work is based in value any type of historical approach, save for a few initiatives that are particularly focused on this. I think, where we've found value is looking to analogous industries that are a lot closer to gender parity, but that were historically male dominated. So medicine, for example, or tech, even the military has some aspects of things that we're borrowing from moving forward. Similarly, there are a lot of other developed countries who are a lot closer to gender parity in their law enforcement. So working with and learning from them, just as a woman. I mean, I'm an attorney by training. I've never once been a police officer, but I found it very emotional to listen to what the Thames Valley Police Department was doing and providing for their women.
Thames Valley, we should just be clear, this is in England. This is the UK.
Yes. Unfortunately, we don't have a beacon that we're pointing to domestically yet, but we're close in some places. But they take understanding the health specific needs of women officers to include things like menopause. Like there are policies to support women going through the transition of menopause. And I mean, I've worked in a lot of places. I don't think I've ever seen that once contemplated somewhere. So the fact that it's being contemplated in a police department, it's beautiful, it's exciting, it's inspiring, but it shows that it's possible, and it starts to, I think, maybe release the taboo of even talking about those types of things. There are things we can be doing, that there's ground that's been broken. We're just working on, making sure that it's applicable here as well.
Sure. I wondered whether there was really going to need to be retraining as well, just in terms of with existing police officers, in terms of getting them to see these arenas in a different way, and whether that was on your agenda as well.
So that's not specifically on our agenda, but it's certainly a complementary and appropriate priority. One area where I think we're going to see a lot of progress that's aided by technology in making these types of changes and actually being able to measure how is it that an officer is interacting with the public, and how you provide specific feedback about how to improve the quality of those interactions. It's a concept called procedural justice, appropriately serving, the folks that you're meant to serve. Things like natural language processing of body-worn cameras, that's expanding rapidly. So the idea that you could actually code somebody's interaction with a member of the public and give them immediate feedback. That was great. That was what you're going for, or that was super problematic, and here's why, and you led to an escalated conflict, and here's how. And that type of feedback is fairly non-existent currently, but it might be something that becomes status quo, relatively soon.
Sure. Can you explain to us, just for the listeners, what procedural justice is exactly, and the four components of it?
Sure. And I'm hesitate to do it because this is such an area of expertise for so many people, and I think I'm going to butcher it. But basically, it's about so definitely you should look it up yourself and trust but verify what I'm going to tell you. But it's the idea that the quality of an interaction between a police officer and the person that they are meant to serve, the elements of that interaction, is critically important to police legitimacy. So there's all these sort of broken down elements of procedural justice. Do you introduce yourself? Are you clear about the reason why you have stopped someone? Do you ensure that the person that you have stopped has a voice in the encounter and isn't sort of immediately put on the defensive? And in promoting those types of interactions with the public, procedural justice is actually even more important than the legality of a stop. So they did some research around individual perception of their interactions with police officers, and they found that if an officer is procedurally just in their encounter, but didn't have a lawful reason for a stop, the person that they were stopping still had a positive outlook on their interaction with the police than if it was a completely lawful stop, but the principles of procedural justice were not adhered to. Then that's a negative perception of their encounter with the police, which of course impacts police legitimacy and people's willingness to cooperate and so on. So it's a pretty fundamental tenet of good policing in this country. There's a fair amount of training around it, but it's, in terms of how do you measure for it? How do you build it into whether or not somebody is promoted? How do you celebrate for it and train for it? There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like in a way it's sort of procedural for how to make people feel seen and heard in these interactions, basically, right?
Once you see it, it's sort of like this no duh moment of course, right? That's how people want to be treated in a normal interaction.
Exactly.
Like,
exactly. That's how anybody wants to be treated in a normal interaction.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like there's a lot of attention now on making sure that police departments themselves are procedurally just internally. You got to treat people the way you want them to treat other people.
Yeah, exactly. No, so the thing that I was thinking about in terms of like police training, like police academies is, and this is just me being dorky, but I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts are about it, is that like when I think about the word strong or strength, right? And the traditional ways that those words are understood, like if you look, Merriam-Webster's definition of strong is having, its first definition, there are a number, but this is the first, having or marked by great physical power. Okay. And then the Merriam-Webster's definition of strength is, the first one is the quality or state of being strong, capacity for exertion or endurance. Number 2, power to resist force. Number 3, power of resisting attack, impregnability. And it struck me that if police have been taught to understand strength as that, which I think it's fair to say that traditionally that has been the understanding of strength, that actually that's a very limited understanding of strength, that it doesn't incorporate qualities of flexibility and capaciousness and resilience and compassion, that all of those things, strength can incorporate all of those things, but that isn't the traditional, especially not the traditional American notion of strength.
Yes. It's interesting. I was expecting to hear resilience and restraint.
Yeah, restraint. Exactly. Restraint.
And that's absolutely the type of strength that is critically needed in policing.
Yeah. And that has not been instilled by our culture in any, I'm sorry to say, but like, look at the movies that mainstream America is raised on, right? Like, look at the ideas of traditional masculinity it's a really rigid notion of strength. So anyway, that's my soapbox for the day. But sorry. I had 2 more questions. One is, what has been your favorite part of this initiative, aside from your massive success?
Thanks. Well, thank you. I think we'll celebrate massive success when we've got 18,000 different police departments. But no, I appreciate it. I'll take the shot where I can get it. I will say, so I've spent most of my career working predominantly in policing spaces, though, outside of agencies. And this is the first, and I've spent many times where I am the only woman in the room. And I get to spend so much of my day in meetings with, it's just a strong group of empowered, passionate women. And I'm like getting emotional, like thinking about it, because it's felt so valuable and sacred almost. And it's a very, very unique thing. And don't get me wrong, I love my men colleagues and we have great meetings too, but it's a very unique thing when you've never experienced it before.
We haven't had a whole lot of that at all.
Years.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it took me 15 years to be in a meeting that was just women. And to be in a room of just women advocating for women is a very powerful thing.
That's amazing. I noticed on the website, on the 30 by 30 website, there's a section where like there are all these profiles of all these different female police law enforcement officers of all different rank and sort of area of expertise. And it made me so happy reading them. Like I thought, God, I want to know every single one of these women.
One of my favorite times is when we get a new profile in.
Yeah.
Okay, that's another favorite part, actually, is actually getting to meet so many different people who are advocating on the inside. And there's just, at a time where it can be very difficult to find sustained reasons for hope in these types of issues, I get to interact with people who give me hope every day. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's pretty great.
Okay, next on the agenda, what is your next big goal for either for 30 by 30, or if you just hit it out of the park and 30 by 30 is done before 2030, then what's your next big agenda?
Well, if you've got any listeners who happen to have billions and billions of dollars that they have free to throw at gender parity and policing, I'm available. Give me a call. But I don't want to take the easy route and just say, get enough funding that this becomes an established center and is appropriately staffed, and people who are doing this work pro bono can actually get appropriately compensated. Like, sure, that's great, but that's sort of a no-brainer. One of the things that I would love to see, and I think would be a mark of success that I could walk away in 20 years and say, okay, we did our thing, was have the importance of women in policing move well beyond 30 by 30. I don't want women in policing and advancing them to be synonymous with 30 by 30. I want it to be synonymous with policing, right? This can't be some one-off initiative. It's so easy for one-off initiatives to rise and then go down in flames or, whatever, all of these different factors that contributed to us being successful in this moment. There might be a host of other factors that come in and mean that a few years from now, we're no longer around. I would love for when people talk about police reform, for diversifying the police force with a focus on gender to be part of the equation of a solution naturally. I want that to be where people go first. And I would love for, when people are assessing police departments to look at gender and demographic diversity across ranks as a measure of success of that department, because it's critically important that they reflect the communities they serve. So rather than just sort of looking at 30 by 30 as an initiative, looking at women in policing as the future and making it just sort of ingrained in the fabric of the profession. That would be incredible. Putting ourselves out of business because people just inherently understand the value of women officers and do everything they can to retain them would be, I think, transformative.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I mean, it seems to me like potentially what we're looking at in terms of a healthy future in terms of law enforcement is basically just the inclusion of voices that have not traditionally been included in solutions. And right, so whether it be women or people of color, right, that there just be a sort of broader notion of how these situations might be, how policing situations might be resolved. And then the other thing I wish I didn't feel like I have to say this, but I do kind of feel like I have to say this, which is that I'm pretty sure that when you're saying that you want women to be seen as the future of policing, that you don't mean that means that there is no place for men in the future of policing and that men aren't invited and that men aren't totally necessary and desired. And I'm sorry, but I do think that there's like a terror there. Often,
Thank you for saving me from myself, because yes, that is absolutely an assumption that people make. Like, this is not a Ruth Bader Ginsburg when there are 9 situation, right?
It's not. And it's not like either or. It's just like appropriate inclusion, right?
The fear of the pendulum swinging so far in the other direction it's really interesting to me. I mean, women have only been 12% for decades. And this is the best it's been since the dawn of profession. We're not even advocating for 50% because we don't think that's a reasonable goal, So yes, this is not an effort to remove men from policing, but I appreciate the opportunity to say that, lest it be misconstrued.
There is an unfortunate kind of national tendency towards overcorrection, right?
Yeah.
Towards this super, super like bipolar almost thinking. And so I think it's worth just everybody taking the moment to just say like, not either or, both and. Right? Like,
yes. Oh my gosh.
Anyway, listen, thank you so much for making the time to be with me today. It was really great to talk to you, Maureen.
No, I really appreciate it. Thanks for making the time.
Isn't she cool? I think she is so cool. I mean, the idea that more women cops will make policing in this country less violent and more effective, it's incredible. So while I think we humans may always be fascinated with violence in some form or other, whether it's NCIS or Grand Theft Auto or Twin Peaks, I think there's also real hope that policing in America will become less violent and more effective in the very near future. In the meantime, I'll be here, trying not to freak out too much about our country, our planet, trying to focus on how much I love being here with you all each week on The Control Variable, getting to talk to you about this crazy world of ours. To find out more about the 30 by 30 initiative or donate, go to 30by30initiative.org. I'm Kim Cutter. Thanks for joining me on The Control Variable. See you next time. Guys, if you like the show, please be sure to go rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps. And be honest, okay? Tell us what you liked. Tell us what you didn't like, what annoyed the hell out of you, what you want to hear more of. I'll listen. I promise. We're in this together, okay? Let's make something amazing. The Control Variable is brought to you by Atomic Whale Studios and executive produced by Jonathan Wilson. The podcast was created by Jonathan, Brian Blatstein, and me. Brian Blatstein is the supervising producer. Rob Okendo and I are producers of the podcast. The technical producer and supervising editor is Derek Michaud of Shelby Rowe Productions. Sound editing is by Alex Aerosmith, and technical support is provided by Eric Totora Patu. Website creative direction by Randy Brasoff. Original music was composed and performed by Dan White. The control variable is managed by Sean Madison. Fact-checking by Kelly Stakopoulos. Megan Petta is our researcher, guest coordinator, and the person who keeps the control variable train on the tracks every day. Finally, I'm your writer and host, Kim Cutter. A very special thanks to everyone who made our show possible.